pupils have done there. So well done on that. And as Antonia alluded to there, when I was a kid, I was passionate about three things: design, biology, and the environment. And I thought about studying biology at university, but I couldn't see the creative side of it. So I went off to become an architect. And then some years later, I had a chance to join the design of the Eden project in the early stages. And it was then that I realized it was possible to bring those three strands together: design, biology, and the environment. So I think it's really important as a child to follow the things you're passionate about, and don't worry too much about how they'll come together. With a bit of luck, you will end up doing something that you love. So I'm going to talk about this idea called biomimicry. And it's about looking at the natural world for the solutions that we need. And I happen to believe that a lot of the solutions we need to make progress on climate change and to address biodiversity loss and so on, we can learn the solutions we need from biology. And I'll give a couple of examples of what I mean by biomimicry. So I guess you're all familiar with Velcro. And Velcro was invented by a guy called George de Mestral. He was an engineer, and he was taking his dog for a walk one day, and he came out of the bushes covered in little seed burrs. And when he took one home and looked at it under a magnifying glass, this is what he saw. The seed was covered in these little hooks, and that gave him the idea for Velcro. And then here's another fun example of biomimicry. Humpback whales, their flippers have these strange lumps on the front edges. And it turns out that those help them move around when they're swimming at slow speeds. They swim in tight circles when they're feeding. And it seems that these lumps improve their what's called hydrodynamic performance. And there was a biologist who looked at that and thought, well, I know what I could do with that. I could design a new wind turbine blade which uses these so that it stays turning even when the wind slows down to quite slow speeds. Because normally what happens when the wind drops is that the turbine stops turning, and then the wind has to pick up quite a lot before the turbine will start turning again. But with these special whale power blades, it keeps turning for more of the year and produces more electricity. And one of the oldest examples of biomimicry is seashells and bird shells. So we know that architects and engineers have studied these for centuries. But what we have now is the huge advantage of better scientific knowledge. So if you look at one of those shells, it's got an abalone shell. If you look at it under a powerful microscope, you can see that it's made up out of these layers of calcium carbonate, like chalk. And this gives it amazing strength. And we created a design for a house based on the same ideas. So it uses the same strong curved forms and the same idea of layers of tiles to create a very lightweight house. So this would use about half the amount of material of a conventional house. And all the lessons in that were learned from looking at the natural world. So I'm going to give a couple more examples, a bit more detail. So this is the Eden project. Some of you may have been. And this was the site when we were starting to design it. It was a quarry, and it was still being quarried for china clay. And it was a very irregular site. It was quite a difficult one to design for. And one of the people in the team that I was working with came up with the idea of thinking of the building like a string of bubbles, which we could set into the site. And the line that you can see around those bubbles, that's the point at which the bubbles intersected with the ground. So we were doing this all on a computer using a model of the site and a model of the building. And then we looked at examples in biology of how to design that structure in the most efficient way. And you can find a lot of examples in biology of globe structures, spherical structures that are made out of hexagons and pentagons. Here's another one. These are microscopic marine organisms. And that's what led to the design of the hexagons on the Eden project. It was actually going to save us a lot of steel doing it that way. And then another lesson we learned from biology is that often quite strong forms in biology are just made out of inflated membranes or pressurized membranes. So in a leaf, those are actually cell walls that are pushed apart by the water pressure inside, and that's what gives the leaf the strength. And so we used a similar idea here, using a type of polymer. It's not actually a plastic because it doesn't contain plasticizers, so it's a very durable polymer, and it's incredibly thin. And if you put it together in 3 layers and then you inflate it, it's a bit like a lilo. It's got a certain sort of strength to it. And this was using about 1% of the material of a glass solution. And it also saved us a lot in terms of steel, because with such large inflated pillows, as we called them, it meant that we needed less steel. And with less steel, we were getting more sunlight into the building, and we saved a lot of weight. So at the end of the project, we worked out that the weight of the building, the stuff that's above ground, that is, not the foundations, but the weight of the stuff that's above ground was actually less than the weight of the air inside the building. We don't often think of air as having a weight, but it does actually have a weight. And this building was so lightweight that it was lighter than that air. So now I want to talk to you about climate change. And this graph shows what's happened to carbon dioxide levels in the atmosphere. So these records come from ice cores. Now, when ice built up historically in very cold parts of the world, it trapped bubbles of air when it formed. And by taking a sort of drill and taking out a whole deep core of ice, you can trace back through history, a bit like tree rings, you can trace back these air bubbles and see what the level of CO2 was in the atmosphere, going back nearly 500,000 years. And the bit most people talk about when they look at a graph of CO2 is the bit on the right-hand side, because that looks pretty scary. You know, that's what's happening at the moment, and that's what's driving climate change. But in some ways, this is the more interesting part of the graph, because it showed that for a very long time, for nearly 500,000 years, the carbon dioxide levels in the atmosphere actually varied within this steady band. And there's a scientist called James Lovelock who came up with a theory that is now quite widely accepted, that explains how this came about. What was the sort of controlling mechanism that kept carbon dioxide in these steady bands? And the story involves these marine microorganisms. So these are a type of plankton, they're called coccolithophores, and they grow these beautiful skeletons out of calcium carbonate in the ocean. So when there were higher levels of carbon in the atmosphere, you would have had millions and millions and millions of these little organisms growing their skeletons in the sea, and then they fall to the ocean floor when they die, and they build up layers of rock. And that would have transferred carbon from the atmosphere into the rock, and that would have stabilized the climate. And actually, that's exactly what you see here. So the White Cliffs of Dover, those are made up from these coccolithophores. And those white cliffs are part of the historical control mechanism for the planet. And so if you're thinking about climate change from a biomimicry perspective, then you could conclude that biology would solve the problem of climate change by making more things out of atmospheric carbon. And Antonio asked me to set a little challenge for the pupils. And so the challenge I'd like to set is for you to make some kind of a house for an animal. So these are 2 examples. These are perhaps bigger than you'd want to make them. The one on the left is a bat house, and the one on the right is a bird house. So I'd like you to make some kind of a house for an animal. And following the lesson that we've just learned about how biology would solve climate change, I want you to use materials that are made from atmospheric carbon, made from carbon in the air. And the easiest way to do that is to use grown materials. So that could be wood, that could be sticks, that could be straw, blades of grass, and so on. So hopefully that's given you a sense of what biomimicry is, and I'd be very happy to take your questions now if you'd like me to.